You're listening to a Roddenberry podcast.
Don't touch that dial. We'll be right back. We'll have more news this evening, but first...
The latest Gene-ology, a Roddenberry podcast.
Episode 56, Sundance and the Black Widow. Welcome to Mission Log Gene-ology. I'm Earl Green.
And I'm Ashley Thomas.
Each week on Gene-ology, we ride into town, step up to the faro table, and get lost in a new-to-us script or episode of Gene Roddenberry's early work to search for the morals, meanings, and messages that would eventually make their way into his most famous work, Star Trek.
But hey, you can join us in the search, too, by listening to us on Mission Log Gene-ology.
You don't even have to be married to the idea of the moral meaning or message of the episode either.
Earl will be back with trivia in a moment, but first, here is how you can reach us. Gene-ology is meant to be entertaining and informative, but it's also just the beginning of an ongoing conversation about the works of Gene Roddenberry. Please drop us a line at missionlog@roddenberry.com and join us on Facebook at missionlogpod. Now, folks, while you're at it, leave us a rating or review at Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast platform. Those 5-star reviews really help folks find the show. And remember, your comments could be used on future installments of Gene-ology. And now, this week's trivia. Earl, walk us down the aisle of the trivia, my friend.
Well, only if no one has any objections that they wish to state at this late stage in the proceedings. One day after Gene's second episode of The Detectives aired, the Writers Guild of America started a 4-month strike. Reruns had become a thing ever since an innovative and unprecedented deal cut between the power couple of Lucille Ball and Desi Arnaz and their network, CBS, left Lucy and Desi with the right to shop their own reruns around. This deal made them filthy rich in real time. No residuals, no waiting until later. They suddenly had the money right now. And the moment that happened, every studio in Hollywood wanted a piece of that same pie. This meant that recorded programming could potentially run forever, provided there was an interest and that there were stations willing to pay for the rerun package. And the ideal magic number was 100 episodes. With 100 shows in the can, running 5 nights a week, the show could be repeated weeknights for at least 20 weeks, almost half a year, without looping around to the beginning. In the days of 39-episode seasons, that meant your goal was to stick around for about 3 years to cross that 100-episode threshold. This is why I Love Lucy and Have Gun Will Travel were already bound for TV immortality, and Hotel de Paree wasn't. Now, the upshot of all the strike talk is that originally there were no residuals paid to cast members or writers of these shows that were now being repeated often, and everyone simultaneously decided, oh yes, we would like residual payments for reuse of our work, please and thank you. Even with Have Gun co-creator Sam Rolfe aboard Hotel de Paree as one of its producers, the show ran for only 32 episodes, Friday nights on CBS. Rolfe brought plenty of talent that had been instrumental to Paladin's success over to his new show, including directors Anthony McLaughlin and Ida Lupino, and one of Have Gun's most enduring writers, one Gene Roddenberry. Let's meet the cast. We have Earl Holliman as Sundance, already a frequent face on the big screen in such films as Giant, Forbidden Planet, and Gunfight at the OK Corral. Earl Holliman became a small-screen fixture as more work beckoned in television, with guest appearances on Bonanza, The Fugitive, Ironside, The $6 Million Man, and co-starring with Delta Burke in her early 90s sitcom, Delta. Okay, now here's a fun fact for you. Hotel de Paree premiered on October 2nd, 1959 on CBS, with Earl in the lead role. And about an hour later that night, if you were still on CBS, you could see him again, starring in the very first episode of The Twilight Zone. Jeanette Nolan co-stars as Annette Devereaux. Jeanette was a series regular on Hotel de Paree, complete with a French accent, co-starring in all but 3 episodes of the show. This is Jeanette's second appearance in one of Gene's scripts. She guest starred in an episode of the Ziv television series Dr. Christian, written by Gene early in his career. And even though we've already covered it on this podcast, her appearance as Blue Dollar Alice in the Have Gun Will Travel episode Alice was a couple of years away in 1962. Starring as Aaron Doniger is Strother Martin, now better known for his big screen roles in such movies as Cool Hand Luke, True Grit, and The Wild Bunch. But in the late 50s and much of the 60s, Strother was easy to spot on TV as well, with guest shots in Boots and Saddles, Jefferson Drum, The Twilight Zone, Perry Mason, Love American Style, and Gunsmoke, with Hotel de Paree being the only time he was a series regular. We will see him again in a small role in an episode of The Lieutenant. We lost Strother Martin in 1980. Guest starring as Sabrina Craig, we have Patricia Medina. Patricia had been making appearances in movies dating back to the 1930s, but she found frequent work after moving from her native England to the U.S. Guest appearances in shows like Zorro, Bonanza, Have Gun Will Travel, The Man from U.N.C.L.E., and Mannix followed. On the big screen, she co-starred with Orson Welles in Confidential Report, as well as starring in Snow White and the Three Stooges, and Abbott and Costello in The Foreign Legion. 2 movies that I don't get to mention nearly often enough on this podcast. This episode was written and filmed prior to the 1960 strike, which became the first ever joint strike of the writers and actors unions, the latter being led by, get this, Ronald Reagan. With both TV shows and movies being rerun frequently on the small screen, both crafts wanted residual payment structure in place for the reuse of that work. And so work came to a stop for both unions jointly for the only time until 2023. In the meantime, mid-strike, Sundance and the Black Widow aired on April Fool's Day, 1960.
There ought to be some way out of this without hurting everybody's feelings.
Your madame? She complains that the hotel is not as grand as you described. She ordered me to provide fresh curtains at the window, new carpeting on the floor, a change of bed sheets.
Annette, you go to her. You tell her, the hotel's broke. Tell her it's falling apart. You tell her I'm worthless, lazy, no good.
The truth will not help.
The truth?
Your madame? She comes here for more than you. I can smell it.
After serving a 17-year prison term, a gunslinger named Sundance is set free and makes his way to Georgetown, Colorado, where he promptly gets into another gunfight and wins. Nobody cared much for the man he killed, and the people of Georgetown are eager for Sundance to stay on as the local marshal. He takes up residence in the Hotel de Paree, run by Annette and Monique Devereaux, and continues taking on whatever troublemakers wander into town, always wearing a hat whose hatband contains a number of silver dollar coins polished to an almost mirror-like shine, which helpfully blinds some of his adversaries if the sun's in just the right place. Act 1. Morning dawns on the Hotel de Paree. Annette Devereaux descends the stairs to start the morning's work. However, she is in for an interesting start to the day when she meets an unusual patron in the hotel lobby. A horse! Calling for assistance from Aaron outside at the general store, she asks him to park the horse in the stable and find his owner, Sundance. Well, they won't have to look far. Sundance is sleeping on the lobby sofa, feet in the air, hat over his face, and faithful dog, useless, on his chest. His friends wake him, and Sundance swears off any future trips to Denver, the wretched hive of scum and villainy, so he calls it, so to speak, over some coffee. The either concussed, hungover, or maybe both Sundance regales Aaron with his tales of Denver. He was at the faro table where this Texas trail boss said something about out drinking Sundance. Then there was a woman who took a fancy to Sundance, who he had supper with, but wait, wasn't he at a faro table? What woman? Doesn't matter. Anyway, he was talking to this Texas trail boss, and then something important happened, maybe? But he can't quite remember what. Aaron asks to see Sundance's gun, and finds it light by 4 bullets. How did that happen? No wonder he's feeling roughed up. Aaron has to go pick up supplies at the rail junction and invites Sundance to go with him. Might be safer for him if he ticked off the crew of a Texas trail boss, but Sundance declines. He's got to figure out what exactly happened on this trip to Denver. A young woman in black rides into town on a horse and carriage. She saunters into the Hotel de Paree, rings the bell, informing the man on duty to let them know Sabrina Craig is here. That's when she turns to see Sundance and greets him with excessive affection, drawing the crowd's attention. "Well, aren't you going to tell them, Sundance?" Sundance, confused but not willing to admit that he doesn't know what she's talking about, suggests they keep it a secret. "We're getting married this afternoon," she says. "How long will it take the parson to get here?" Realizing what he's gotten himself into, Sundance quickly denies the existence of a parson. "But wait," says one of his friends, "what about the one over at the farm?" "No, we don't. We don't have one of those." "Sure we do. You know, the circuit rider. He came into town to baptize a new dentist baby. I'll go get him." Sabrina leaves to get ready, and Sundance tries to figure out just how he got himself into this mess. Act 2. Sundance speaks with Annette about his trip. It's slowly coming back, but he still can't figure out why he used his gun. Annette says that his new fiancé is complaining that the Hotel de Paree isn't quite as grand as Sundance described it. She wants fresh curtains, new carpets, a change of bed, and more. Sundance tries to get Annette to tell Sabrina that the hotel's broken. He's no good. He's good for nothing, lazy, worthless. "That truth won't help," she says. Well, dang, Annette. Harsh burn. She thinks Sabrina is here for something else besides Sundance. But Sundance doesn't buy it. After all, he apparently bowled her over in Denver. She's just not gotten to know the real Sundance. She'll fall out of love faster than she fell in, he says. Sundance goes to see Sabrina in her room, but instead of knocking on the door like a normal person, he Kool-Aid Mans through it. "The door was unlatched," says Sabrina, unimpressed. Sundance goes into a big speech, laying down the law about how things will be with them. When he says frog, his women jump. You got that? But before he can go any further, Sabrina says, "Oh, Sundance, I was afraid you'd changed," and then begins planting smooch after smooch on him. Well, Sundance is quite confused about this reaction. She says he's just like her first dead husband. He'd plow right through a wall to get to her. Oh, by the way, all her previous husbands have definitely died. The second one by suicide, and the third by defending her honor in a gunfight. She's been so lonely since he's been gone. Well, Sundance isn't without compassion and begins consoling her. That's when she reminds him of just why he's down 4 bullets. He shot all the cards out of the card dealer's hand, daring anyone to stand against him. That's how she knew she needed his help. But from what? It's not important, or so she says. Act 3. There's a party going on in the lobby of the Hotel de Paree. The parson has requested a sit-down between him and Sundance. Now, there's been a few rumors floating around about how Miss Sabrina might be a bit of a, well, Jezebel. The parson's not going to hear any ill-willed gossip, but wants to know that Sundance and Sabrina are going to take their vows seriously. Otherwise, he's not performing the wedding. The parson says he only hopes Sundance deserves her. At that point, Sabrina enters the room and every eye is upon her. Sundance decides he's not good enough for her and has to figure out a way to get out of this wedding. Sundance hoots and hollers, declaring more drinks on the house. And with his best Thor impersonation, he smashes his glass to the floor and starts dancing with one of the other girls present. You know, the one he's not about to marry, and plants a big ol' smooch on her, too. One of the men says that Sundance needs to have a good punch in the mouth for acting like that on his wedding day. Sundance says that he's going to have one last big fight before his big day and starts to take on every man in the room, landing a punch or two before Sabrina steps in and says that she knows what's happening. Sundance says he's not giving up his carousing just because he's getting married. Who's next? Me, darling, she says, and now it's her turn to plant a big smooch on Sundance. Well, this is not working out at all, is it? Time to get on with the show. Even if the parson thinks that Sundance ought to have a good tanning for acting like that. But wait, what's that about tanning? Sabrina, red tanning, who is that? Sundance says he's been going about this all wrong. Should have just spoken up instead of acting like a horse's patoot. Sabrina's ex, boyfriend, is a man by the name of Tanning. She's been trying to break it off with him, but she's not been able to find a man with enough nerve to help her end things. Sundance, under the influence, must have bragged that he was tough enough to do it. Ain't that what happened, Sabrina? The parson sees the look on her face to know the truth and shuts his Bible. That is, until a man from the back tells him he can go on with the wedding. It's Red Tanning, Sabrina's bad boy boyfriend that she just can't shake. Sundance suggests that Red step in and marry Sabrina instead. After all, he had first claim. When Sabrina starts to protest, Red tells her to shut up. He'll get married when he's ready. Sabrina starts to protest again, but Sundance shouts at her to keep out of it. Sundance says that she's marrying him because Red can't commit, and it broke her heart, so she hooked up with a man that would. Red tells Sundance to get his gun. Sabrina is furious. Are you two trying to tell people that a man would rather die than marry me? Annette, get my gun, please, Sundance says. Sabrina tosses her a bouquet, but not in the all the single ladies way, and storms away from the altar. Red clears the room. There won't be a wedding today. One of the men warns Red that he's bringing Sundance out of retirement. He may not like what he finds at the end of Sundance's gun barrel. Red realizes he may have bit off more than he can chew. He meets Sundance at the bar and asks him if he's ever slowed down just a bit. Sundance thinks that maybe he has, but they're probably about evenly matched. Here's the thing, though. Red doesn't want to marry Sabrina either. Now they have to fight, and one of them is going to have to marry her. Good job, dude. Well, this is not the scenario that Sundance expected. How are they going to get out of this one? Sundance and Red take to the street to face each other. Red calls him out, and Sundance steps out, his hat agleam in the high noon sun. Sundance draws on Red and shoots him. That seems to be the end of it, and as he turns, he finds out that Red is only mostly dead, and shoots Sundance. He's down now, too. Sabrina, watching from her window, tells Annette to send someone up for her luggage and to ready her carriage. She's going out of town now. The next day, Aaron rides up to see a pine box in the back of a carriage. Who's in it? Sundance. No! Sundance, I warn you! He leans his head against the box in mourning until a voice says, Aaron, get your feet off my head. Sundance, you're alive! I might have knowed you was too ornery to die, Aaron says. Sundance introduces Red and the two shake hands. Sundance explains that they rigged themselves up a show to rid themselves of a mutual friend. No biggie. How was your trip? Aaron says he had a real good trip. By the way, how old do you think I am, Sundance? I just had a girl guess my age about 10 years younger than I am, and she was in need of some comfort. She was so lovely and so lonely, so I invited her to come back and stay for a visit here at the Hotel de Paree. Sabrina? Why, yes, that's her name. How do you know her? Red and Sundance make a break for their horses and ride off as fast as they can go. Aaron, befuddled, asks why they're running off like the devil himself is after them. His friend responds, well, you must be younger than you look. 'Cause you ought to know the devil happens to be a female. Aaron smiles as our story fades to black. The end.
Thank you very much, Ashley, for the excellent recap. You already told me something that I somehow completely missed looking up trivia for both this show and this episode, and that is the name of the dog.
Yes, Useless. I found it on IMDb because I couldn't quite understand what they were saying, and unfortunately there are no closed captions for this episode that we have. But Useless is in fact the name of the incredibly cute dog, which I don't think is actually useless.
Yeah, that's a terrible name for that dog. And the funny thing is, the dog is the only member of the cast other than Earl Holliman, that you see in the opening titles.
Right, legit. You'd think like he'd have an on-screen credit, but no.
Yeah, and I will say this about the opening titles. I actually had a lot of notes about this because first time watching an episode of this series, but also because of how we do this show, it's the last time, and so I've got to cram all the observations in now instead of spreading them out. I really like the theme music. That's some fine, dramatic theme music.
Yeah, it's pretty nice.
But we get the music, we see the gun, and then the dog. And it's just like, tension dissipated.
Yeah. I was like, I've never watched a Western that had a really cute dog in it.
Yeah. I kind of want to see more of this series to see if the dog ever plays a truly useful role in the action. Because...
yeah, it's a good question.
Surely we could make that happen. Now, also from the opening titles, I don't know if you noticed this, and it seems like such a simple thing to do now. Nowadays, you would do this by putting the actor in front of a green screen or something and doing it all in post. But there's this cool wipe effect where Holliman walks in front of the show's logo and it disappears while it's behind him. For 1960, that was some really fancy stuff.
It was. It really was. And got that nice little flare with the silver dollars on the hat.
Yeah. And then I noticed the very last name in the end credits was a credit for the show's main title designer, Maurice Binder. Now it all makes sense. Brace yourself for some extra trivia here.
I'm ready. Bonus trivia!
All right. Though he was born in the U.S., Maurice Binder had been working in the U.K. for much of the 50s, mainly creating titles for films directed by Stanley Donen. That also gave him the visibility and landed him the job of creating the iconic title sequence for a little movie called Dr. No.
Oh, is that
Maurice Binder invented the famous James Bond gun barrel open. And with only 2 exceptions, he designed all of the James Bond title sequences up through 1989's License to Kill. Now, this was really a rarity for Maurice because he was sought after for creating opening titles for British movies, and here he is doing American TV. I found that really surprising. So, unexpected James Bond connection to this show for everyone who is a fan. Speaking of fans, I think Ms. Devereaux is going to have fans put in all the windows because we got us a house horse.
Yeah. House horse. How about that?
I've talked about spending a lot of time around horses in the past, but I don't even need to call on that experience to explain why horse in the house is a terrible, terrible idea. Because horses are great big animals, and they're accustomed to peeing and pooping wherever they happen to be standing, and then they move away from it. Because they're great big animals, and gravity exists.
Yep.
It happens all the time. They do their business, and then they move, because that business gives off an odor that could be smelled by predators or anyone, really. I will say that.
Anyone with a nose.
Yes. Anyone who is gifted with the olfactory senses. And just because that horse is standing on a hardwood floor, that horse is not going to think, "Oh, Wilbur, this isn't dirt. I better just ixnay on the bodily functions." That's not going to happen. There is a reason that horse trailers are built so you can remove, clean, and eventually replace the floorboards.
Yep.
The horse is going to do their business wherever. He doesn't care about damaging the wood. Now, imagine that in your house. Or it's not a house, it's a hotel lobby, so even worse.
Well, and my thought was initially, she's coming down the stairs and, oh snap, there's a horse? LOL. My thought was like, is it snowing outside? If you're cold, they're cold. Bring them inside. Was that what was happening? She walks out the door. Aaron? Nope. It's a bright sunny day. There is no reason for that horse to be parked in that hotel lobby.
Absolutely not. And
oh, geez, Louise.
Yeah, I'm here to book a room, Whittleburr. Now, all of that out of the way, it does kind of clue us in. This show is a lot lighter than, say, Have Gun Will Travel.
Yeah, definitely a lot lighter for sure. Does Sundance give you big Bruce Campbell as Briscoe County Jr. vibes, if for no other reason than the extremely square jaw and prominent chin?
You know, I hadn't made that connection, but if you were to remake Hotel de Paree now, yes. Yes, early 90s Bruce Campbell. Yes.
Yeah, and to be fair, I have not watched Briscoe County Jr. since the early 90s, unfortunately. And I remember really loving that show. It was like one of the only shows like my dad really liked to watch with me, and it's because it was a Western. And I remember being 9 years old and thinking, gosh, Briscoe's so dreamy. What a guy. Not realizing until somewhat recently, oh snap, that was Bruce Campbell? I had no idea. Go on.
It wouldn't be Gene-ology if there wasn't some kind of history lesson jammed into the observations somewhere.
Yeah.
So let's talk about Pharaoh.
Yeah, I've never heard of Pharaoh. What's that?
Okay, so it is a card game, and there is more than one way to spell it. You can spell it like an Egyptian pharaoh, or, more commonly now, at some point, it got dumped down to F-A-R-O. And there's also more than one way to play it and cheat at it. And so it has a very checkered reputation, to put it mildly. It's descended from a French card game, which looks like it's spelled Basset, but because it's French, the back of my brain is screaming it might be Basset. And both Pharaoh and that game were banned in France in the late 1600s. It was simply causing too much trouble. Now, it did get exported to England, which is probably where the name got shortened down to F-A-R-O, and then it made its way to the United States. Now, because the odds were said to be better than one's odds at a poker table, it gained widespread popularity in the U.S. and was indeed a fixture of the Old West. Though it was also easy to rig a game in favor of the house to the point that there were commercially available decks printed and sold to gambling establishments to ensure the house couldn't lose.
Well, that's not very nice.
But supposedly that became its own cottage industry as a response to rampant cheating by players.
So, you're cheating. So we're going to cheat back.
We are going to
even
cheat.
the odds. So basically, no one has a fair shot.
We're going to cheat even harder.
You know what? I'm going to cheat even harder. Sorry. I had to make the Michael Scott face when I did that.
Yeah. So this is about the point that Pharaoh came to be regarded as a scam and not a game at all. And yes, it did cause plenty of impromptu gunfights. There were 2 Supreme Court decisions involving Pharaoh dating back to the 1800s. After World War II, it fell out of favor, although you could still play Pharaoh in Las Vegas through about the mid-80s. But at that point, poker overtook it again in popularity, and so now Pharaoh's fate is to be used mainly as a historical reference point, particularly in Westerns. And by the way, if you've seen the movie Tombstone, Wyatt Earp and Doc Holliday both were, in fact, Pharaoh dealers.
Things I did not know.
Well, I didn't either until I watched this, and I was wondering what the game was because I had never heard of it either.
Earl, I feel like we need to give a warning for anyone who might want to go try to watch this episode or to go try to find an episode of Hotel de Paree. The opening credits need to come with a warning for people with epilepsy because of all the flashing lights off of Sundance's hat. I almost said Briscoe's hat. Sundance's hat.
You know, I've got a question about that because in the lead up to the the gunfight, and this is gunfight with air quotes.
Yeah, gunfight.
We see the flash of the hat. And as mentioned, this was a feature, not a bug. This was frequently used to defeat Sundance's enemies in more serious episodes where there was a more serious gunfight. I wonder how this method of self-defense came about. I mean, did he have Aaron Donninger stand across the street? Like, okay, stand over there where a gunfighter would stand. Okay, and we're going to come out here like once every half hour until the sun goes down, and you tell me when you're the most blinded.
Yeah.
How did we find this out? Because you have to figure that is going to inform, okay, we're going to meet out in the main street at 3:41 p.m. exactly.
Right? And my thought is, like, how did this guy get the name Sundance? The Sundance Kid, that was a thing, right?
Well, the sun is dancing in the reflection of all the...
Yeah. Well, I mean, yes, that makes sense. But I was just thinking before I read that little bit in the synopsis of why he's called Sundance, I'm like, it seems like an odd name for a tough cowboy.
Well, he said he'd been to Denver. Maybe he went even further than that and visited the film festival sometime.
Yeah. Maybe that's it. Sundance Film Festival. There you go.
Speaking of Denver, okay, let's talk about lines that read completely differently now than they did in 1960. That line being, I hooked up with her in Denver the other night.
Yeah, that's not a thing you're going to be saying out loud in 1960.
I can't even say it with a straight face, but yeah, at least one of my eyebrows hit the ceiling and left a small dent when I heard that. I was like, whoa!
Wow. You ought to try out for a Vulcan if your eyebrows can do that, my friend.
Like 1960. Whoa! Boy, we give Gene credit for seeing into the future, but whoa!
You keep using that word. I don't think it means what you think it means.
Exactly.
That's my second Princess Bride reference for the day.
There are never too many of them.
But yeah, I definitely, it's like, ooh, I don't think it means that back in that time, but watching it now, like, yeah, Sundance, I bet you did hook up with her.
Well, he doesn't remember. I mean, so this becomes one for the ages.
Guess we'll never know.
Yeah, it's a mystery because he was that hungover when we started the episode.
Legit.
I liked the guy who played the parson, who was there to officiate the wedding ceremony. I couldn't find many credits for that gentleman. His comic timing and just his poker face were impeccable.
Oh, yeah, no, he was great. And I'd respect a person that says, if you're not going to take this seriously, I ain't going to marry you. Like he's not a drive-through wedding chaplain dressed like Elvis. But I like that he was like, hope you deserve her as soon as she walks in the room. And he's like, dang, girl.
Yeah.
That was like the most like straight-faced, dang, girl, like I ever saw in my life.
That guy, how did he not get brought back for Star Trek? Because his eyebrow action, he's prime Vulcan material right there.
Yeah. So that is a good question. Earl, it must be said so many times during this episode, like, ooh, Sundance, you're looking so making-outy tonight.
Well, I mean, give Sundance a little bit of credit. I mean, he hooked up with her in Denver the other night.
That's true. He did, in fact, hook up with her in Denver the other night in either a very concussed or drunken state, or why not both?
Why not both? Multitask.
Why not? Why multitasking? I can also be very, very drunk and also very concussed. Showed you. We'll get into this a little more in discussion, Earl, but some of the lines she says, and admittedly, some of it is, you can look at it a little differently because she's supposed to be this Black Widow charlatan kind of character, but Sundance is yelling at her, when I say frog, my women jump, and she's like, oh, Sundance, I was afraid you've changed. I was like, what? No one's going to say that to me and not get punched in the mouth. I'm sorry. The end of the episode where Red and Sundance find out, oh no, Sabrina's coming back, and they jump on their horses and ride away lickety-split. Men will literally fake their own deaths before going to therapy, is what I kept thinking the whole time this episode. Or perhaps maybe not even necessarily need to go to therapy here, but to have an honest conversation of, no, we don't want to marry you.
Yeah, can confirm.
I did laugh at the line, telling her the truth won't make it better. After he says, "Tell her I'm no good. I'm lazy. I'm whatever." And she's like, "Tell her the truth won't make it better." It's like, "Damn, girl, get me to the burn unit."
Yeah, my takeaway from this episode was I kind of want to see more of that character.
Yes,
and I want to
that was the gal that went on to play Blue Dollar Alice,
yes.
Correct? All right. I didn't realize that watching it, but now I'm like, okay, this tracks.
Yeah, I want to see her get a bigger share of the action. I had kind of the opposite reaction to the detectives. You know, we covered 2 episodes of the detectives, and that was almost 2 more episodes of the detectives than I really needed in my life. I mean, I'm glad we were actually able to see them. But this show, I came away kind of wanting to see more of the series, if only to kind of figure out how this one fits into it. Is this above average? Is this below average? Does the dog get any more screen time? That's a real important question right there.
Does the dog have any lines?
Hey, it could happen. Okay, Ashley, it looks like the wedding has been called off. Especially since the guys have ridden off into the sunset together. A whole different thing now than it was in 1960, but that's all I'll say. You could remake this and put a completely different spin on it, which might actually be a good idea because I had some issues with this story about yourself.
Yeah, I had a few. First of all, this Sabrina character, I'm not saying that there aren't certain people like Sabrina who are black widows or gold diggers or whatever you want to call that. I won't say that those people don't exist, but it is a tired stereotype that is often only applied to women. And so we've got this kind of idea going, and so I'm not a big fan of that, even though it does seem to be exactly what she's going for here. She's at the altar, about to get married, and Sundance is all like, no, you had first claim, because she's property, and so you can marry her. And when she starts to protest, Red says, "Shut up." I'm like, all right. Well, then she starts to protest again. Sundance says, "You keep out of this. You keep quiet now." I'm like, okay, this whole thing is over if she just walks out the door. I don't understand why she's not getting pissed off at both of them and throwing the bouquet at them both and said, "Peace out. I'm gone." That would be what I would do if I were in her shoes. I cannot imagine a scenario where I would ever try to con somebody into marrying me. But I think, the other thing that really bugged me in this episode, but it's also a really good example of how this plays out in real life, is there's such a thing as attractiveness currency, as pretty currency, especially if you're a woman. If you are perceived as attractive or pretty, you will go a lot farther. People will treat you differently. And as someone who was often perceived as not having that kind of currency growing up, I know what it's like to be treated differently if you don't have that, the quote-unquote pretty currency or whatever. And as much as this episode drove me nuts, I think this is a really good example to explain to someone, please note how she is being treated differently by literally everyone, even though she has this reputation of being a Jezebel or a Black Widow. She walks into the room and some man has given her flowers. Even the person who was previously voicing concerns to Sundance about him marrying her unless they were serious about it, sees her and he's like, well, I hope you deserve her, Sundance, because that's a good-looking woman right there that's just walking through the room. Because obviously that is the only thing she can contribute to society is how good-looking she is. And so there was a lot that I found kind of disturbing in this episode, honestly.
Okay, you did kind of blow my mind with the attractiveness currency element, because that was not really something that landed in my notes. Other than that, I think our notes are very similar. We homed in on exactly the same scene and exactly the same line. At the altar, Tanning tells her to shut up. Sundance tells her, stay out of this. She doesn't get to say a word for herself. And that's one of my biggest problems with this whole thing, is almost all the information we get about this woman comes out of the mouths of men. She doesn't get to say a lot for herself. I mean, we get this kind of silly, weepy scene where she talks about having 3 ex-husbands, none of them still living.
Mm-hmm.
Other than that, all she really gets to be is a walking pile of innuendo, and everyone else is talking about her. But we don't find out what is her plan, what is motivating her. Is there any more to her than the labels that are being applied to her, again, by the men in the story, who refer to her as a Black Widow or a Jezebel? I realize the show is only 26 minutes long. Why even, if this is how you're going to do it, why she even have speaking lines to begin with?
And to be completely fair, she's operating in a society in which the pretty currency, that's what she's got to spend. Because, if she doesn't have family or other ways to support herself, then yeah, her looks, that's how she's going to survive. So, again, I want to think of it fairly from that perspective, but that's not how this episode reads. It's just her taking advantage. It reads as her taking advantage of people, not her trying to survive, which, the road to Wickenburg, this is a similar discussion that we had.
It's the proximity to better parts for women in Gene's Have Gun scripts that really makes this stick out like a sore thumb. Ella West got to tell her side of the story. As silly as that episode occasionally was, she at least got to put her viewpoint across. Juliet gets to tell her side of the story. Maggie O'Banion, she gets to explain herself. Blue Dollar Alice, Jeanette Nolan, she gets to speak for herself. Why not Sabrina? And the kind of frustrating thing is, because we don't have the script for this, we just have the show. And by the way, for those of you who want to see the show for yourself, last I checked, it is on YouTube. So look up Sundance and the Black Widow, and hopefully it is still there. But there's just this weird discrepancy between Gene's script here and stuff that Gene has written that was far superior. And also, side note, I was not a huge fan of Sundance kind of manhandling Sabrina in a rough way, about the time he's telling you that when he says frog, his women jump. It's easy to laugh at that line, but it's also like, what in the world does that even mean, dude?
Yeah. And, this is after he has Kool-Aid manned through the door that was unlatched. Because, why not knock like a normal person? I don't understand. Like, bro, what are you trying to accomplish here? I mean, unless this is like another segment of the manhandling of trying to, shake her off of him or whatever, but.
Yeah, there's no real story reason for that to have happened, other than that we are trying to make Sundance look as goofy as possible.
And even in that scene where he's attempting to throw her off by being rougher than he actually is in real life, she's not hearing him. She's like, "Oh, Sundance," like blah blah blah. I thought you changed. Okay, I have concerns, but then also like as soon as she starts kissing him, it's like, oh well, oh this is nice, okay, and then he starts being all makey outy with her too. I'm like, come on, bro, you're not doing a good job here of trying to throw her off the set.
Yeah, all I can figure is that Sundance is actually kind of supposed to be bad at his job. This is not a serious Western. And that's kind of the sad thing about this. I kind of want to see more of this show because Earl Haldeman, like you said, kind of has a little bit of the late 50s, early 60s version of 90s Bruce Campbell energy.
Right.
He's obviously kind of a goofball. Add in Jeanette Nolan and Strother Martin, okay, we've got a nice little ensemble cast, which is definitely something you don't get with Have Gun. It's a nice alternative to that. It's just that somewhere in here, this script kind of winds up not feeling like one of Gene's scripts. And occasionally, this is the risk of doing what we do on this podcast and kind of doing these drive-by showings where this is the only episode we get to see of this. I guess, really, that's my hope, is that somewhere out there is more Hotel de Paree, and that it's better than this episode, because I think we both homed in on multiple layers of ick. Okay, it's been said like 3 or 4 times now, it needs to be a t-shirt.
Still a great grunge band name.
Yes.
It's frustrating. Part of the reason I homed in on the pretty currency, the attractiveness currency, is because unfortunately that still exists. I have been told multiple times, and I talked about this a little bit in OOS, that like, oh, well, if you dress this way, or if you wore some makeup or whatever, you would be pretty. Again, one of my coworkers told me something along these lines, and it wasn't meant in a disparaging way, but in like, hey, let's be a little more professional way, which, that's fine. Also, because this kind of currency applies to women. She's not having conversations like this with the guys that we work with. They can kind of do whatever they want. And I'm like, yep, and I don't like it. I understand that she is right, because unfortunately it happens. But I don't like it. It's like, you should want to hire me because I'm a good worker. I'm a damn good DJ. Reasons you should want to work with me. I'm fun. Not because I dress a certain way. The reality is this currency still exists, and I think this episode highlights that in a way that you almost don't think about unless it's happened to you.
Right, Ashley, it looks like the wedding decorations are being put away, and the horse is back in the house!
The horse is in the house!
Yeah, mixed feelings. I have a feeling is kind of our theme for this episode, our solitary episode of Hotel de Paree.
Moral meaning message, if you have a calculating look and wear black dresses, you too might be a Jezebel. Another title for this episode might have been Poor Communication, the Western.
Yeah, exactly.
What do you have to say, Earl?
Well, I really wanted to like Hotel de Paree, just period. Yeah. It's got a very different setup from anything we've watched before. Since this podcast has the kind of unusual assignment of following a single writer from show to show, we don't really get to spend a lot of time with each show unless Gene stays there for a long time, like he did with Have Gun Will Travel. It's a luxury if we get to spend weeks and weeks with Paladin, but shows like this or The Detectives are, I think I said earlier, they're a drive-by, and that's really how it feels like I've been sideswiped by this show. I liked the cast of this show. I liked the regulars. I liked the less than serious tone. All of that I thought was a promising setup. I just wanted more from a script that I knew was written by Gene Roddenberry. I wish
Yeah.
Gene had stuck around to write more episodes of this show, because he can write women better than this. And he's also pretty good at writing comedy. There is some funny stuff in here, but some of it's funny if you're in 1960. I would love to have seen a better Gene script for Hotel de Paree. Because we know he can do funny. We know he can create women who are fully rounded characters and fully fleshed out and do them justice. For whatever reason, it didn't happen here. And so I felt like it was a letdown. And yet I still kind of want to see more of the series to see if all of them had these same problems.
Right. It's frustrating because we know Gene is capable of more and better. And then again, we also don't know what changed from script to film to editing room.
True.
And that's the same with everything put to film. I feel badly for every woman watching this show when it aired. I feel badly for every little girl watching this show with her dad when it aired. And it's like, don't be like that. And also, you only have value if you're pretty. Because look how the men in the town treat Sabrina when she rides into town versus how they respect Annette. They respect her sister. But no one's falling all over themselves to help her out of her carriage, to bring up her bags, to buy them flowers. That position is only reserved for really pretty women who have calculating looks and black dresses, apparently. But also, if you are that, you are a Jezebel and a Black Widow.
It seemed like there were messages in this episode. It's just none of them were good ones.
Yeah. I mean, this is America Ferrera's Barbie speech all over again.
Oof.
But this time, in 1960.
Mission Log Gene-ology is produced by Roddenberry Entertainment. Special thanks to the Roddenberry Repertory Players. Our cast this week featured Brendan Berndt as Sundance and Crystal Allen as Annette Devereaux. If you would like to support us directly, you can do so at patreon.com/missionlog for early access to shows and the Mission Log Discord. If you have any material that might be of interest to us that isn't already in the Roddenberry archive, drop us a line at missionlog@roddenberry.com. Our website is missionlogpodcast.com.
On the next Gene-ology, 333 Montgomery. Special thanks to consulting producers Matt Esposito, Homer Frizzell, Rand Hurl, Tom Kozak, Julie Miller, Mike Richards, Mike Schabel, Paul Shadwell, and David Takechi.
Back next week with more of your favorite programs. This concludes our broadcast day.
This is a Roddenberry podcast. For more great podcasts, visit podcast.roddenberry.com.